Christmas is supposed to be a time of joy and warmth, but what happens when the holiday spirit turns into something much darker? In tonight's chilling stories, you'll hear about a family haunted by an eerie shadow, a Christmas doll with a secret, a member possessed by an ancient evil, and a cat that refuses to leave its home. Brace yourself, because these terrifying tales are about to blur the line between holiday cheer and the horrors lurking in the shadows. Stay tuned, if you dare. The ghostly cat at Christmas. It had been years since Sarah had last returned to her childhood home for Christmas. The house, once full of life, now stood silent and cold, its old wooden frame creaking under the weight of time. The expansive yard was barren, the lush garden where she'd played as a child now overrun by weeds. As Sarah stood at the foot of the long driveway, the crunch of gravel underfoot echoed in the stillness. The wind tugged at her coat, and she shivered. The house had always given her a sense of unease, especially in winter. She remembered how the house seemed to sigh with the wind, how the attic windows would fog up, and how the doors creaked even when no one was near them. But it was the cat, Whiskers, who had haunted her childhood memories the most. Whiskers was more than a cat to Sarah. He was a companion, a protector, a friend. He had been with her through every stage of her youth, her late-night study sessions, her heartbroken teenage years, and the moments when she just needed someone to comfort her. His soft, gray fur and green eyes, always full of love, had been a constant presence. But that all ended 6 years ago. Whiskers had disappeared one cold winter night, never to return. It had broken Sarah's heart, but life moved on. Or at least, she tried to. Now, with her parents gone, it felt right to return to the old house, to find some sense of closure, or perhaps to simply face the ghosts of her past. Inside, the house was as she remembered it, cold, drafty, and quiet. The fireplace sat untouched, the old couch covered in a thick layer of dust. The smell of cedar and old wood filled the air. Sarah set down her suitcase and wandered through the rooms, each one a reminder of a time she wanted to forget. She paused in the living room, where a tall Christmas tree stood in the corner. It seemed out of place in the empty house, like a mockery of the holidays. As she stared at the tree, memories flooded back, Whiskers playing with the ornaments, chasing the lights, curling up by the fire with her. She hadn't thought about him in years, but here, in the house where they had shared so much, the memories were impossible to ignore. That evening, Sarah lit a fire and settled into the armchair by the hearth, trying to shake the feeling that something was wrong. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and the flames flickered in the fireplace. She wrapped her hands around a mug of hot chocolate, but her thoughts kept drifting back to Whiskers. It was then that she heard it, the unmistakable sound of soft paw steps, padding across the hardwood floor. Her heart skipped a beat. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, and she turned slowly toward the source of the noise. She could see nothing in the dim light of the room, but she was sure she had heard it. "Whiskers?" she whispered, her voice tentative, barely a breath. The sound stopped. For a moment, everything was still. The wind outside seemed to fade, and even the crackling of the fire seemed to quiet. Then, she heard it again, a soft tap, 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 like the padded footsteps of a cat walking across the floor. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She couldn't explain it, but she knew. She had to be imagining things, surely. But the sound continued, growing louder now, drawing nearer. "Whiskers?" she said again, louder this time, almost as if calling out to a long-lost friend. She got up slowly from the chair and moved toward the hallway, her steps hesitant. As she reached the door to the stairs, she froze. There, at the bottom of the staircase, stood a shadowy figure. It wasn't entirely solid, more like a wisp of smoke, yet there was something distinctly familiar about it. A small cat, with gray fur, standing as still as a statue. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, piercing through the darkness. Whiskers. Sarah's voice trembled as she whispered the name. The cat did not move, but its eyes, those piercing green eyes, locked onto hers. For a moment, Sarah was frozen in place. Her pulse raced as a chill ran down her spine. The cat's eyes seemed almost too bright, too alive, as though they were watching her with an intelligence far beyond that of any normal animal. It was impossible. Whiskers had died 6 years ago. She had buried him herself in the yard, beside the garden where they had spent countless summer afternoons together. How could he be here now? And yet, there he stood. A soft sound broke her reverie. A faint meow, almost like a whisper, echoed from the shadows. Sarah's legs shook as she took a step forward, but the cat didn't move. It remained in place, staring at her with an intensity that made her feel as though it could see right through her. "Whiskers?" she called again, her voice a mixture of disbelief and fear. This time, the cat seemed to stir. Its tail flicked slightly, and it took a slow, deliberate step toward her. But as it moved, something strange happened. The cat's body began to dissolve, as if the very substance of it was evaporating into the air. Its form grew blurry, and then it vanished entirely, leaving behind only the faint scent of old fur and dust. Sarah stumbled back, gasping. She blinked, trying to process what had just happened. Her mind screamed that it was impossible, that it must have been a trick of the light or a figment of her imagination. But her heart knew better. Whiskers was gone, yet somehow he was still here. A sound, soft, almost imperceptible, came from the far corner of the room. It was a voice, but not the voice of the cat. It was her mother's voice, faint and distant, but unmistakable. "Sarah." Her breath caught in her throat, and she spun around, eyes wide. Her heart raced as the room seemed to close in on her. The voice was clearer now, coming from all around her, a whisper in the darkness. "Sarah, come closer." Her knees went weak, and she collapsed into the chair by the fire, her hands trembling around the mug of hot chocolate. The fire crackled loudly, but the room felt impossibly cold, as though the warmth had been sucked out of the air. She clutched her chest, trying to steady her breath. Was she dreaming? Was she losing her mind? A sudden thought struck her, a terrible, gut-wrenching thought. Her mother had died just 2 months ago. She hadn't been able to visit her in the hospital. She hadn't been there when her mother passed. The guilt had eaten her up inside. But why would her mother's voice be here now? And why had Whiskers appeared in the form of a ghost? The room seemed to pulse with energy, as if something unseen was moving, watching, waiting. Then, for the briefest of moments, Sarah felt it, a presence, a cold breath on her neck, a fleeting sensation of something brushing past her. A shadow moved across the floor, and Sarah turned just in time to see the faint outline of Whiskers, his green eyes glistening in the dark. "Whiskers," she whispered again, her voice barely audible. But this time, she knew. She knew that the cat was no longer just a pet, it was something more, something ancient and protective, bound to her by a love that even death could not break. Whiskers had returned to watch over her, to guide her through the darkest parts of her grief. As she sat there, the house around her seemed to settle, the oppressive weight lifting just a little. Sarah closed her eyes, a sense of peace washing over her. The wind outside howled louder, but she no longer felt afraid. The voice of her mother faded, replaced by a warm, comforting presence. Whiskers, her faithful companion, was with her again, and somehow, she knew everything would be okay. She didn't need to search for closure anymore. The house, the memories, the grief, it had all come full circle. The love that had once bound them all was still there, in the whispering wind, in the glowing eyes of the cat. As she sat in the chair, the fire flickering before her, she finally understood. Some spirits don't leave. They stay, watching over us, waiting until we're ready to see them again. The shadow on Christmas Eve. The Harris family home sat nestled on a quiet hilltop, far from the prying eyes of the city. It had been in the family for generations, the sprawling Victorian mansion and heirloom that seemed to carry the weight of its history. Every Christmas Eve, the family gathered in the grand dining room, its long oak table heavy with the smell of roasted meats, freshly baked pies, and the rich scent of mulled wine. Laughter and warmth filled the house, as it always did on this night, but there was something in the air this year that felt different, something unspoken and cold, hanging just beyond the edge of their joy. Olivia Harris, the youngest daughter, couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It was subtle at first, a shiver down her spine when no one was near, a chill in the room that didn't belong. She had tried to ignore it, telling herself it was just the old house, the strange noises that always seemed to accompany the wind, but as the night went on, the unease grew. The house was alive with activity. The turkey was carved, the children had opened their presents, and the grown-ups were sipping brandy and laughing softly by the fire. Olivia couldn't bring herself to join in. her mind too preoccupied with the strange sensation in the corners of the room. She excused herself to the kitchen, where she hoped the warmth of the oven and the sound of clinking dishes might help her relax. But as she entered, she froze. There, in the doorway of the kitchen, was a shadow. At first, she thought it was just the angle of the light, but the longer she stared, the more it didn't make sense. The shadow stretched unnaturally long across the floor, moving in ways that no ordinary light source could create. It was a silhouette, but not of anything concrete, just a black, twisting mass, like smoke caught in the air. Her heart began to race. She stepped forward, calling out, "Mom?" But the shadow did not respond. It continued to move, creeping slowly toward her, following her every step. "Olivia, are you all right?" Her brother, Mark, had entered the kitchen behind her, concern in his voice. Olivia whipped around, startled. She hadn't noticed him come in. Her eyes darted back to the doorway, but the shadow was gone. Did you see that?" she asked, her voice trembling. Mark looked confused. "See what?" "The lights are flickering again." She glanced at the dining room and saw her family still gathered around the table, oblivious to the strange occurrence. "Never mind," she muttered, trying to shake off the feeling. But as she turned back to the counter, the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She could feel it. The shadow was still there, still watching her from somewhere she couldn't see. That night, as the family gathered around the fire, Olivia couldn't shake the sensation that something was lurking in the corners of the room. The air was thick with a quiet tension. The lights flickered once more, and a sudden draft swept through the room, despite the fireplace crackling with warmth. Olivia's eyes darted around, but it was when she glanced toward the hallway that she saw it again. The shadow. It was no longer just a fleeting shape. This time, it stretched across the floor, growing longer and more pronounced with every second. Olivia couldn't breathe as the shadow moved toward her, creeping along the wall like a living thing. She backed away, her heart hammering in her chest. Suddenly, it was gone, vanished as quickly as it had appeared. The room was filled with an eerie stillness, the crackling of the fire the only sound. "Are you all right?" Mark asked again, noticing her pallor. "You're looking a bit pale." Olivia swallowed hard, trying to hide the fear in her eyes. "I'm fine," she said, forcing a smile. But deep down, she knew she wasn't fine. She felt as if the shadow was still with her, watching her every move, lurking just beyond her vision. Later that night, when the house had grown quiet and the family had retired to bed, Olivia lay in her childhood bedroom, staring at the ceiling. The shadows of the room seemed to stretch and twist in the dim light of the street lamps outside, creating strange patterns on the walls. The unease she had felt all evening only grew stronger now. She pulled the covers up around her neck and closed her eyes, hoping to drift into sleep, but the shadows felt so alive, so ominous, that sleep eluded her. And then, the whispers began. It was soft at first, like the rustle of leaves in the wind. Olivia sat up, heart racing, listening intently. The whispers grew louder, a chorus of voices, urgent and desperate. She tried to ignore it, but the voices seemed to come from everywhere, surrounding her. "Help me," one voice pleaded, echoing in the room. "Get out," another hissed, the tone harsh and malicious. The temperature in the room dropped, and Olivia could see her breath in the air. The whispering intensified, filling her head, drowning out everything else. Terrified, she ran to the door, her hands shaking as she twisted the knob. The moment she stepped into the hallway, the whispers stopped. The house was silent again, the air still and cold. But something was different. The shadows in the hall had shifted, darker now, stretching and reaching toward her. She could see them moving, crawling up the walls, sliding along the floor, as if they were trying to trap her. Olivia ran. She stumbled through the hallway, her heart pounding as she threw open the door to the living room. Her family was gathered around the fire, laughing and chatting, unaware of what had just transpired. The shadows in the room seemed to retreat when she entered, as if the presence in the house recognized that she was no longer alone. Her father looked up. "Olivia? What's the matter? You look like you've seen a ghost." She shook her head, unable to speak. Her body trembled uncontrollably, but her voice failed her. All she could do was stand there, frozen, watching the shadows retreat into the corners of the room. The Christmas decorations glowed brightly in the warm light of the fire, and for a moment, the oppressive atmosphere lifted. But Olivia knew it wasn't over. She could feel the weight of it pressing on her chest, suffocating her. The shadows were still there, waiting, watching. That night, as the family retired to bed, Olivia lay in her room, unable to sleep. The whispers had stopped, but the sense of dread never left her. She lay wide awake, staring at the shadows on the wall, knowing they were waiting for her to close her eyes. The next morning, Olivia found something strange. Written in the condensation on the windowpane was a message, scratched into the fog, as if by invisible fingers. Help me. The possessed family member on Christmas night. The Coleman family had always prided themselves on their festive spirit. Every Christmas Eve, their home was a haven of warmth and cheer, lights twinkling on the tree, the smell of gingerbread filling the air, and the sound of laughter echoing through the halls. But this year was different. The weight of something dark had settled over their home, and it was impossible to ignore. Megan Coleman, the youngest daughter, could feel it. Something was wrong. Her mother, Susan, was acting strangely. At first, it was subtle, an odd look in her eyes, a sudden change in her mood, an uncomfortable coldness in her voice when she spoke. But as the night wore on, it became more and more apparent that something was terribly wrong. It had started when Megan and her brother, Danny, had come downstairs to find their mother sitting by the fireplace, staring into the flames. She hadn't even noticed them enter the room. Her eyes were glazed, her posture rigid. She looked like a stranger, someone who didn't belong in their family home. "Mum?" Megan had called, her voice tentative. "Are you okay?" Susan didn't respond. She just sat there, her hands clenched into tight fists at her sides, her gaze fixed on the fire. Megan had exchanged a nervous glance with Danny, but neither of them knew what to do. Their mother had always been the heart of their family, kind, loving, and full of life. This was not her. "Mum?" Megan repeated, louder this time. "What's wrong?" Finally, Susan blinked, as if waking from a trance. She turned to look at her children, but her eyes were different. They were dark, hollow, as if something had drained the life from her. "I'm fine," Susan said in a voice that wasn't quite her own, sharp, cold, and unfamiliar. But it wasn't just her voice that unsettled Megan. It was her entire demeanor. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, like someone who didn't know how to move their own body. Her face, once soft and warm, had taken on a strange, almost monstrous expression. There was something lurking behind her eyes, something that wasn't her. Megan felt a chill crawl up her spine as she stepped back, trying to understand what was happening. "Mum, you're scaring me." Susan stood up suddenly, too quickly, her chair scraping against the floor with an unnerving screech. She smiled, but it wasn't the smile Megan knew. It was too wide, too forced, and it didn't reach her eyes. "You should be scared," Susan said in a voice that sent a shiver down Megan's spine. "There's something inside me now. Something hungry." Danny, who had been standing by the door, stepped forward. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Mum, what's going on?" For a moment, Susan didn't respond. Her eyes flashed with something wild, something manic. Then, without warning, she lunged at Danny, grabbing him by the arm with terrifying strength. Megan screamed as her brother struggled to break free. "Let go of him!" Megan shouted, her voice filled with panic. But Susan didn't seem to hear her. Her grip was unyielding, and her face twisted in a grotesque grimace. "You don't belong here," she hissed, her voice now deeper, more guttural. "None of you do." Megan ran toward her mother, her heart pounding in her chest. She grabbed Susan's arm, pulling with all her strength, but it was as if her mother was no longer human. Her skin was cold, almost like stone, and her body was unnaturally stiff. "Please, Mum, stop," Megan begged, tears streaming down her face. "We're your family. You don't have to do this." Susan's eyes locked onto hers, and for the briefest of moments, Megan saw something, the faintest flicker of recognition. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by that dark, hollow gaze. "You've got to get out," Susan said, her voice now flat and emotionless. "Before it's too late." Suddenly, a loud crash came from the kitchen. Megan's heart skipped a beat as she turned to see the table had overturned, the chairs scattered across the floor. There, standing in the doorway, was their father, Thomas. But he wasn't acting like himself either. His face was pale, his eyes wide and empty, like he had been overtaken by something. "Dad?" Megan called, fear rising in her chest. "Dad, what's going on?" Thomas didn't respond. Instead, he simply stepped forward, his body moving with an eerie precision, as if he were being controlled by an unseen force. "Megan, you shouldn't be here," Susan said again, her voice now almost a whisper. "You don't know what we've become." The room grew colder, the air thick with an oppressive darkness that seemed to close in on them. Megan took a step back, her eyes darting between her parents. The people she had known and loved all her life were no longer there. They had been replaced by something sinister, something that wanted her gone. As the minutes passed, Megan realized the truth. This wasn't her family anymore. They had been possessed, taken over by something ancient and malevolent. And the worst part was, there was no way out. The house itself felt alive, its walls closing in, the air heavy with an unnatural energy. "We have to go," Danny whispered, his voice breaking. But it was already too late. The door slammed shut, trapping them inside. And as Megan turned to face her parents one last time, she knew, no matter how hard she tried, she could never escape. They would never be the same again. The doll as Christmas present. When Lily received the doll for Christmas, she thought nothing of it. It was just another present, something to add to the pile of toys that her parents had bought her. She had no idea how much that doll would change her life forever. The doll was beautiful, with porcelain skin, flowing blonde hair, and eyes that seemed to glisten with an unnatural life. It was dressed in a fine red velvet dress, its tiny shoes polished to perfection. Lily could tell it was expensive, the craftsmanship flawless. She placed it on the shelf next to her other toys, not thinking much of it. That night, as Lily lay in bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The doll, beautiful as it was, seemed to be staring at her. Its glassy eyes followed her every move, and its lips seemed to twitch in a way that made Lily's skin crawl. She turned her back to it, trying to ignore the creeping sense of unease. But then she heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. A voice, coming from the direction of the doll. "Lily." She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The voice was soft, almost sweet, but there was something chilling about it. She turned over slowly, her eyes wide in terror, but the doll was still in the same position as before, sitting on the shelf, motionless. Shaking, she pulled the covers up to her chin, trying to convince herself it was just her imagination. But the whisper came again, this time louder, more urgent. "Lily, come closer." Lily squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the sound. But it was no use. The voice was inside her head now, echoing with a strange, hypnotic pull. "Come closer, Lily. I'm lonely." Terrified, Lily sat up in bed and glanced over at the doll. Its eyes were no longer just staring, they were watching her, pleading with her, as if it had come alive. She wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. All she could do was stare at the doll, its eyes glistening with that same eerie light. The doll's lips moved again, but this time the words were clear. "Lily, you're mine now." Suddenly, the doll's head twisted unnaturally, its body jerking as if possessed. It slid off the shelf with a soft thud, and the whispering grew louder, more frantic. Lily screamed, leaping from her bed and bolting out of the room. But as she ran down the hallway, she felt a cold hand grip her ankle. She looked down to see the doll, crawling on its porcelain hands and knees, its face twisted into a grotesque grin. She tried to pull away, but the doll's grip tightened. "You can't escape me," it hissed. "You're mine, Lily. Forever." With a final scream, Lily broke free, running out of the house and into the night. She never went back, and the doll was never found. If these stories left you with chills down your spine, you're not alone. Remember, the world of true horror is much closer than we think, and sometimes, it's hiding in the most unexpected places. Thank you for tuning in to Phantom Realities, where we bring the most spine-tingling true horror stories to life. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon to make sure you never miss a terrifying tale. And remember, in the world of phantom realities, the fear is always real. See you in the next story. If you dare.